Rock on, everyone. Welcome back. It's the final countdown review day one. Uh, I'd really like to thank the Academy for that wonderful performance. Thanks to everyone, my family, my support system. I couldn't have done without you. The Grammy for Best Musical Performance, New Artist, is really, I'm just humbled. So I'd really like to thank everyone. As you guys can tell, I purchased a piano keyboard as my quarantine impulse buy, so that's been quite entertaining. I hope you enjoyed that below mediocre performance. Anyway, back to the basics. So we're on the final countdown. We're starting day one of our review for the AP Psych exam, which is going to be May 19th. That's a Tuesday at 1 p.m. So we're going to do each day is going to be a different unit. Bigger units like research methods and cognition are going to take up 2 days. So we'll crank it out and kind of do a crash course each day. So just to get started now on the basics, we're going to do part one of research methods today, cover the perspectives real quick because we're experts on those. So going into our 7 psychological perspectives, from nature being more biological to nurture being more environmental. And we know that these kind of fit in to the combined holistic biopsychosocial model. And this biopsychosocial model is what psychologists prefer as kind of the best new way to analyze behavior. We know that psychological perspectives are just like putting on a different pair of glasses for each one and kind of analyzing behavior in a different way. But we know that it's too limiting, especially with our abnormal psych unit. We said it's too limiting to look at just biology because you're missing out on all the social aspects that impact you as well. But if you're looking at just the social, we know that nature also plays a really important role. So that's why it's best to look at biopsychosocial as kind of a holistic way of viewing behavior. And psycho in the biopsychosocial model kind of stands for cognitive, so related to your thinking processes. So you guys can look through this on your own time and kind of put together those key words for each perspective. So remember, when you are trying to identify a perspective, you can think biological is having to do with brain structures, neurotransmitters. Evolutionary is Darwin's theory. So it's all about natural selection, survival of the fittest. Cognitive thinking, humanistic, self-actualization, rainbows and unicorns. Psychodynamic is Freud's with your repressed memories and the unconscious, desires and needs. Behavioral is our kind of one from the learning unit. So all about involuntary, so classical conditioning, or voluntary associations. And rewards and punishments, the big one for operant conditioning. And sociocultural, we didn't get to that unit because it's not on the AP exam anymore. But we know that's all about kind of how culture and where we're from impacts us. So a lot of you guys were asking for the different famous psychologists that you guys should know. Not every single one of these, every single one of the important psychologists to know is on here because some of them don't really fall neatly into a perspective. But I'm going to be making a Google slide that's dedicated to every single psychologist that you should know with some kind of key terms to remember them by. That'll be coming up soon. But I put them on here from kind of each one. We know Freud is psychodynamic. Big one for humanistic, rainbows and unicorns, is Maslow and Carl Rogers. Cognitive is Loftus with the car crash leading questions. Piaget has the cognitive stages of development. Lorenz is the one who looked at instincts and had the little geese following him from imprinting. So that's evolutionary because it's an instinct. Behavioral is Watson with little Albert. Ivan Pavlov is the dog salivating. Skinner has the Skinner box with operant conditioning. And then Tolman has the cognitive maps. And then sociocultural, Bandura I put a star because he has his own social cognitive theory. So he would kind of be cognitive and sociocultural. and he's Bash and Bobo. Phil Zimbardo is one who we don't need to know for AP exam now because that's sociocultural, but he did the prison experiment. And Milgram does the shock experiment, but we don't need those because they're not on the AP exam anymore. So real quick, touching on the history of psychology. So these are kind of the OG perspectives, but we don't need to know them as the current modern perspectives being used because they're kind of the historical ones. But still important to know is developing psychology into what it is today. So let's think back, way back to like our third day of class. We talked about structuralism, functionalism, and Gestalt perspectives in early psychology. And we used the little puzzle piece analogy to put it all together and make sense of that. So structuralism, remember that is where you're describing the structure of things in your brain. So structuralists really cared about the different parts in your brain and identifying what they looked like, their structure, and using introspection to report what you're thinking inside your mind. So that was self-reporting what you're thinking. Functionalism is, this is with William James, and I should say structuralism is with Wilhelm Wundt. He was the father of psychology, and then functionalism is with James. Functionalism is saying that it's important to look at the function and purpose of the different parts of our brain. So not only just saying kind of what they look like, but saying what their purpose is. What's the function? And it's really important still, and when we get to the bio unit, right, to know the different functions of, oh, this one's for memory, this one's prefrontal cortex is for making judgment and decisions. So he cares about that. And then Gestalt, we know, is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So they care about all the big picture, not so much what each little individual thing does or the little things you're seeing, but rather what the whole picture is. So the puzzle piece analogy works into this, in that structuralism is saying what color the puzzle piece is, what it looks like. Oh, this one's green. This one has a horse on it. And then functionalism is, instead of saying what color it is and describing it, you're saying what the function is. So, oh, this piece serves its function as a corner piece or a middle one or an edge. So that's going to be much more helpful to you, especially all of you guys doing puzzles now in quarantine. That's going to be more helpful to you in putting the puzzle together than just saying, oh, it's green, because there's probably 500 green pieces in your puzzle. And then Gestalt is once you put the whole puzzle together. So Gestalt psychology doesn't care about each individual puzzle piece. They only care about what it looks like when it's all together. Because they say, when you're looking at the completed puzzle, you're not seeing all the individual pieces. You're seeing just the image that it creates. Maybe it's the nice skyline that it made. And you can watch here my little example from Ferris Bueller's Day Off when they go to the art museum, and it's the pointillism painting. And he, originally you see a beautiful Saturday in the Park painting, but then when Cameron looks at it closer and closer and closer, you begin to see the little dots. But Gestalt would say, yeah, you guys didn't notice that it was all little dots that made up the picture because it's the whole that matters. Geez, guys, it's so windy in here. I think I'm going to blow away. So now on to the important stuff with research methods. So just to divide it up into what's important, experiment is its own thing. So an experiment is special and unique because it causes causation. Just know that forever and ever, that an experiment is the only research method that can prove causation. Other things, correlational, can show that things are related or connected or associated, but there's nothing that can prove X causes Y, but an experiment. So the way that an experiment is able to do that is by manipulating one variable, so your independent variable, and then measuring and controlling everything else to make sure that the dependent variable is changing only as a result of the independent variable being manipulated or changed. So experiment is the only thing that can prove causation, and that's because you're able to manipulate the independent variable and hold everything else constant. Correlational research is not causation, it's correlation, it's finding an association. So correlation does not equal causation is the big moral story that you need to know for the AP exam. So it's finding an association between two things. And while a limitation is that it doesn't prove causation, it's still really important to know that it is finding an association and relationship, because that can allow you to make predictions and say, oh, well, it looks like X and Y are related. So let's do a research study and maybe set up an experiment now to go further in depth and see if this really is, connected. So within the realm of correlational research, the main one is survey. So typically when you're thinking correlational, you can think survey because you can give someone a little multiple choice questionnaire and you can easily kind of say, okay, well, all the people who answered that they are OHS seniors also seem to answer that they're sad about not being in school. And you can say very clearly, oh, look, there's a correlation or an association between those two things. But case studies and naturalistic observations could also be a part of that correlational research, and that you might be able to, through those observations, find some associations and connections between things as well. So we know, starting, that case study is just a very in-depth investigation into one or a few unusual or unique cases. So a big thing to note is that, one, it's very in-depth, so that's why it's very narrow, and you're really spending a lot of time researching these people. But the other thing that's really important to note is that it's just the few, it's a unique case. So it's something that's kind of abnormal and different that you wouldn't typically see, which is what makes the case study really exciting. So if you're saying, oh, well, it seems like they're studying like the triplets or something, that wasn't a case study in Three Identical Strangers because they didn't have something really unusual or abnormal to them. They were just triplets. That wasn't out of the blue. So that wouldn't really be a case study. Case studies would be reserved for those people who had like the traumatic brain injuries that we wouldn't be able to, ethically put on someone. So we have to wait for these unique situations to arise randomly, because we can't ethically, make someone cut into their prefrontal lobe. So the example would be Phineas Gage, whose prefrontal cortex and frontal lobe was damaged. HM and our buddy Clive Wearing, who had the hippocampus damaged. Those are all great examples of case studies because they had something really unique and abnormal happen to them that we don't know when the next time we're going to see someone with a severed hippocampus is. That's really rare. And then survey, obviously, just think self-report questionnaires or interviews, anything like that. And these could be open-ended or closed-ended. So it could be multiple choice or it could be like written response. Okay, next we have the naturalistic observation. This one's one of my favorites. And big thing here is you are watching subjects without interfering in their environment. So they shouldn't have an idea that you're there. You're trying to watch from afar. And the purpose of this is that there's this thing called demand characteristics, in which participants who know they're being watched, also called the Hawthorne effect, participants who know that they're being watched might react differently. So think if someone's going to come observe you at work, or if Mr. Curtis came in to observe my classroom or something, right? You're not really getting a gauge of what things are usually like, because you're going to be acting a lot differently and probably trying, to perform better when you're being watched by your supervisor at work or something like that, or by a researcher. So naturalistic observation tries to get rid of these demand characteristics, the Hawthorne effect, by watching subjects without interfering. So you can think like an animal researcher on National Geographic Planet Earth saying, oh, I'm watching the wild crocodile in his natural habitat. But you don't want to interfere because the animal obviously would act very differently if they knew you were around. So you might want to disguise yourself or something like that. Then we have underneath here is the separate category of longitudinal and cross-sectional studies. So important thing to note with these is that typically they're not kind of their own research method by themselves. They're kind of paired in with another one. So longitudinal could be paired in the case of three identical strangers. I said that it was a longitudinal field experiment, and that a field experiment is an experiment that takes place in the real world. So you're still manipulating variables, but it's outside of a lab. So it's not fully causation because there's confounding variables in the environment that could impact it. So longitudinal study, think three identical strangers because it's following the same group or participants over a long period of time. Longitudinal. The twins stayed in that study and probably would have stayed in that study if they didn't find out for a long, long time through their adulthood. Cross-sectional studies is kind of the opposite of longitudinal. So you're looking at people who differ in one key characteristic. And we typically look at these when it comes to development. So let's give the example of age at one specific point in time. So rather than following the same people over a long period of time, you're going to take a little cross-section of the population and maybe look at some 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 25-year-olds, all at one point in time. So it's not the same people, it's different people, but they're trying to kind of mimic what a longitudinal study would do, but make it shorter and more cheaper and accessible. So it's at one point in time. Obviously, the limitation with that is that there could be some differences due to just who the people are and their generation that might kind of confound the results. So a big thing, pay attention to this stuff because this is what the AP exam likes to know. So in addition to being able to recognize just what identifying a research method, so maybe they give you a little blurb excerpt and they give you a study and then they ask, what research method would this be? Or is this an experiment? Or is this correlational research? So being able to identify based on what they're saying, whether it's an experiment or correlational or what research method it is. So that's important. But then also what's really important is if they give you the research method, being able to evaluate the pros and cons or strengths and limitations of that research method. So I put together this nice little chart for you guys that goes through each research method and says what the pros and cons are. And I tried to bold the ones that are extra important and just good ones to kind of have memorized so you don't have to look back at your cheat sheet and just can be, boom, easy. Here's the pro, here's a con. So experiment, what did I say? Experiment proves causation. It's the only one that can. So that is the biggest pro out of them all. And kind of little pros within that is that this is because only in an experiment can you manipulate the independent variable to measure if the dependent variable is changing as a result. Only in an experiment can you control for extraneous or confounding variables by holding everything constant and doing random assignment and things like that to make sure there's no third variables in the way. And you can only do that in the lab experiment where things are very highly controlled. And then a con would be that conditions are super artificial, right? If it's taking place in a lab, it's definitely not like the naturalistic observation where people are acting naturally in their normal habitat. In a lab, we said that this is low ecological validity. And that's a really fancy word that I used in IB psychology. So low ecological validity, if you want to impress a AP reader, it just means that the conditions are artificial and not like the real world. So very artificial, low ecological validity. And then we also have the Hawthorne effect, or I'll add demand characteristics. And I said demand characteristics are when you know that you're being observed by a researcher and therefore are kind of changing your behavior. Typically, trying harder or trying to be a better you because you're being watched. You might guess what the hypothesis is of the experiment, and then start trying to perform in a way to please the researcher. Lots of issues going on there. You also have the expectancy bias, with again, where the experimenter is trying kind of unintentionally encouraging participants to respond in a certain way. And you can fix this with the double-blind study. And then you have confirmation bias, in which the researcher, this could be experimenter bias as well, in which the researcher might pay attention to kind of evidence that's supporting what they want to see from the study or what their hypothesis is, and not really paying attention to things that are proving them wrong. So there could be confirmation bias at play, and the researcher is kind of only interpreting results in ways that fit what they want the outcome to be. Okay, then we have correlational research methods. And again, kind of correlational is that big category of just things that can prove there's a connection or association between two different things. So pros, main ones would be that it can happen outside of a lab, so you're much more flexible in what you can do. And it's still a pro that you're finding an association between two variables, because this could allow you to make predictions and then maybe do an experiment down the road if it's ethically feasible. And it can be efficient because if you think something like a survey, you're able to get really large samples and send a survey out to a bunch of different people in a very short amount of time and for little cost. Biggest con to correlational research is it can't prove causation. So if you ever see something that's correlational in an FRQ and then they're saying, the person that they're writing about is saying, oh yeah, so they found in their survey that blank is tied to blank. Yeah, now they think that it causes that, or it confirms their belief or hypothesis that X causes Y. We know that that's not right, and you can point that out as a flaw because their results wouldn't be valid, because if they're saying that X causes Y, you cannot prove that in a correlational study. Things like surveys could be prone to inaccurate reporting, and it's hard to manage the impact of confounding or third variables because you're in the real world. You can't control everything like you can in a lab. And then the case study, it's awesome because it's really thorough and specific, and you have those rare cases like Phineas Gage with the pole through his head and Clive Waring with the severed hippocampus, where you can't really study these through an experiment ethically, and these don't happen too often. So it's really exciting to be able to study this rare behavior or rare kind of occurrence. And then the cons to it, though, is that because it's so few people being studied, like, Clive Waring's one person, Phineas Gage is one person, they're definitely not representative of the larger population. So you wouldn't be able to generalize your findings and apply them to the greater population. And it could be time consuming. Think like Clive Waring, you're studying him his whole life, so that you wouldn't be getting immediate results. And again, with all correlational studies, you can't prove causation. Surveys, awesome. They're cheap, quick, easy. You can get a large sample size because you can send out a survey to however many people, like a census, by mail to everyone. Issue is that big one, it's self-reported data. And like I said, remember we talked about flashbulb memories and how sometimes what you self-report, even if you think it isn't fully accurate, and you're unable to fact check that. You're not that person. You're not watching them. You don't know if what they're saying is true or not. You could, like I said, have a memory lapse and think you remember something correctly, but not. There also could be biased or poorly worded questions. And this hits into Elizabeth Loftus with the leading questions. And those can sometimes alter your memory. So, for example, did you see the yellow car? There might not even have been a yellow car, but the fact that they're alluding to one being there, you might say yes. So again, or smashed versus hit. Those two words both activate the different schemas and could cause you kind of to respond in a certain way. And again, you can't prove causation with a survey. It's correlational. Naturalistic observation, big thing is that it's authentic and therefore, like I said, your fancy word of high ecological validity. While a experiment has low ecological validity, naturalistic observations, very authentic and high ecological validity. But that again comes at the expense, because it's the kind of direct opposite of an experiment. The researcher has like zero control, whereas an experiment you can control everything to know that X causes Y. Naturalistic observation, the researcher can't do anything. So that could be frustrating if you're trying to study something and then your little elephant you're watching walks away, or you can't control things and can't control your variables. So there's plenty of third confounding variables that could be in the mix. Again, can't prove causation. Another issue is that what you're studying might not be exactly what you're studying. So say you're coming to school to study a typical day at Oconomowoc High School, but maybe it's the day after prom. So you think you're studying what a typical day is, but then, all the seniors are gone, classes are watching movies. So you think this is a typical day, but clearly it isn't. Okay, and then like I said, going back to correlation, these are correlational research methods. Big thing is that correlation does not equal causation. And this could be where that third variable problem shows up, right? So a recent survey by the Institute of Scavone found that people who eat ice cream are more likely to get sunburn. So maybe you gave a survey out and people responded that, yeah, I ate ice cream. Oh, yeah, I also got a sunburn. And you're saying, well, it looks like ice cream is causing more sunburns. But we know that there could be a confounding or third variable that's at play here. And this is the sun. And that's the issue with correlational research, is that you can't control and make sure these third confounding variables aren't showing up. If you had an experiment, you could control for this and make sure that this third variable isn't in the picture and that it's only your independent variable that's proving or resulting in a change in the dependent variable. Okay, and then finally our last two, the pros and cons of longitudinal and cross-sectional. So longitudinal, we know this is recent from the developmental unit, that it allows us to look at the same subjects, the entire study, so we can see changes taking place over time and generations. So it's giving us really rich data. It's very thorough, and you can be pretty confident that participant variables, so different people being involved at different ages and things, aren't impacting as a confounding variable in the study. So it's nice having the same people, and you know that it's not kind of some differences in who they are as individuals that's causing the results to change. Con would be that this is super time consuming. If you're following people for their entire life, like I said, sometimes even longitudinal studies, the head researcher could die and then it gets passed on to someone else and keeps going. Expensive, therefore, because it's going on for so long. And other big one is that there's potential for participant dropout. If you're doing a study that's going on for like 40 years, there's a good chance that some participants are going to drop out along the way. And then that begs the question of, are these people who are dropping out different in some important way than the people who are staying in? And then like all the others, it can be difficult to prove causation. Cross-sectional study. This is obviously much quicker than something like a longitudinal study because it's typically just a cross-section, one study usually, and it's done. And it results in fewer participant dropouts than the longitudinal because it's happening at one time. So you don't really have a chance for participants to drop out. But then again, the issue here is it's only just a snapshot. It's not a moving picture of how they're changing over time. And again, opposite of longitudinal, you can't be absolutely sure that the results aren't due to things like the confounding variable of different individual participants that might just be different in unique ways and causing the results to change. And then with correlation, I know people had questions on this, is the correlation coefficient. So the correlation coefficient is kind of how strong the relationship is between two things. And this goes from -1 to +1. Uh, and the closer it is to -1, the stronger the negative correlation. The closer it is to +1, the stronger the positive correlation is. And we know that positive correlation means that as one thing goes up, the other goes up as well. So say the example of, let's say, ice cream and sunburns. Ice cream goes up, sunburns go up as well. A negative correlation would be when one thing goes up, other goes down. So say winter, so as the weather gets colder, or as there's more snow, the amount of sunburns goes down. So you could say there's a correlation, negative correlation, or inverse correlation, in that they're going in opposite directions. It's a negative correlation. And then no correlation looks like this, kind of funky, because it's all spread out, because there's no really association or connection between the different things. So positive correlation, think positive slope, it's going up. And the closer it is to the positive one, the more closer to the line they're going to be. And then the closer it is to 0, the more spread out it's going to be like this. Negative correlation, same thing. The slope's going down, and the closer it is to -1, closer it is to that line. So just to kind of make this even more clear, again, -1 is a very strong negative correlation. -0.5 would be like, and the closer it is to 0, the less of a correlation. There's not really an association. 0.5 is positive, and then closer it is to 1, +1, a really strong. So, right, no correlation would be here at 0, and then strong negative here, strong positive here. So you can kind of pause this and look at that to kind of take it all in. To look at that big thing, -1, +1, is where it ranges from. So that was a lot of stuff. I hope that was helpful. I tried to break it down into the most important things, knowing the pros and cons of the different research methods. And again, you don't need to have all these memorized, but just be confident in like those 1 or 2 things that you can say to criticize or support a research method. And then being able on an FRQ to identify, this is an experiment because whatever. And we're going to talk fully about experiments tomorrow. It's a whole lecture dedicated to kind of operational definitions, independent, dependent variable, random assignment. So being able to identify the characteristics of an experiment, and then being able to say if it's correlational research or not, and kind of what research method it is based on what they're giving you. So big things there. So just an example here of why it's important to be able to identify and pull out the characteristics of each type of research method. So this is the 2019 FRQ. So this is last year's research methods FRQ. And this was actually the one that I gave for our developmental FRQs for option 1, the one at like 8 a.m. for a developmental unit. So we have part D, ask for you to explain why the study is not a naturalistic observation. So here it's really important to be able to identify those key characteristics of what a naturalistic observation is. So here they're kind of, you can clearly see here, there's a dependent variable that you're manipulating and things are changing, right? So you can say, there's manipulation of an independent variable and there's control there, so it wouldn't be a naturalistic observation. Probably the easiest thing that people would say would be, well, it's not a naturalistic observation because if you read into this, I'm not going to read the whole prompt, but if you read into this more, it's not naturalistic because the researcher is interacting with the participants and moving things around in the study and participating actively in it. So it would not be a naturalistic observation because they're not sitting back and observing, they're actively participating in it. So that's an example of a real deal FRQ in which you would need to understand those key characteristics of a specific research method. So homework for today, complete a practice research methods FRQ. So, like I said, it's really important to be able to identify the different research methods. And in this one, this is from like 2005, 2006, I think, research methods FRQ. So, again, real deal one. And this one's about evaluating. So, going back to those charts that I had of the pros and cons. So, a good example there. And what I'd like you guys to do is turn that in by 11:59 p.m. I'm going to go through, put a check, return them to you, and then you're going to grade yourself on them with the rubric that I'll give tomorrow morning. Also, keep working on your research method cheat sheet using this video and the little worksheet of AP FRQ Research Methods 101 type stuff that I gave to kind of guide you in creating that one-page cheat sheet that you can use on the AP exam. And then keep working on Units 1 through 3 vocab review packet. Again, it's probably best to do that as you're going along through these videos because it'll be fresh in your mind and you'll be better able to make a accurate and strong example that connects to you and is easy to remember and understand. And then if you want, work on that extra credit and pick out some funny videos that connect to psychology terms. Okay, have a great day, you guys. See ya.